Welcome to In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson. Our topic today is the environment. We recently learned of a UN report containing some dire facts and predictions about the world environment. Among other things, it says that up to 1 million species are at threat of extinction. The chair of the group that produced the report, Sir Robert Watson, said, quote, "The health of ecosystems on which we and other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We're eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide." In order to talk about this report and some other topics having to do with the environment, we have a guest on, Rick Reibstein, who's been on the show before. He's an environmentalist, a teacher at BU, and has a blog where he writes about his ideas about the environment, and we're happy to have him on again. Thanks for coming on, Rick.
Thank you, Steve.
You bet. So this was quite a report that
Yeah.
just recently came out. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, I can only hope that it breaks through the fog a little bit and wakes up some people. I mean, this is just the latest in a long series of reports that should have alarmed the people of the world to an extent that we actually take effective action. And so I always have the hope that maybe it will. However, I have to say that when I got up this morning and looked at it on the front page of the New York Times, I thought, oh, that's the Times. But are people reading other newspapers, seeing this? Are people getting their sources of information elsewhere? Are they mindful of this? And it made me immediately think about the takeover of local news across the country by corporate interests, and of course the Fox Media Network, and all of the information that people are getting, which is not inclusive of this and is not getting into people's consciousness the emergency that the world is now facing.
So it's possible if you only look at certain media outlets that you might miss this altogether.
You might miss this altogether, or you might get it secondhand through an intellectual like yourself or for me and say, oh, well, that's just them, and they have some sort of bias in thinking this way, which is one of the tragedies of today, equal to the loss of extinctions, is the loss of faith in objective truth and the ability of certain propagandists to manipulate people's ideas so they don't even take in this information. Or discount it, disavow it when it comes in.
A different U.S. president might make a big deal about this and talk about it and try to make sure that people know about it. It seems unlikely that this president will do that.
No, I don't think there's a chance of that. And so the battle is joined now. We are in, as they said at the beginning of the revolution, these are times that try people's souls. And I think the constitutional crisis has been met. This president has declared his unwillingness to obey the Constitution, to respect other branches of government. And it is now incumbent upon every citizen to take a stand on what we're going to do with this world. So the issues of democracy and governance are directly related to these issues of whether we're going to be able to take action to protect the ecosystem.
Can you say more about that very topic, democracy, governance, and how it's related to environmental change, how ordinary people might have an impact on those things?
Yes, so I think the first thing is to recognize that we've been sitting back for years and we've allowed something to happen that should not have happened. We've allowed lobbyists and corporate interests to have a say in government. And we need to recognize that that's not what government is for. With this idea that government is there to get out of the way so business can do whatever it wants, and maybe even just to support business, such as working its foreign policy to support businesses' interest in getting oil from foreign countries, which has then led to foreign wars and all kinds of dysfunctions in our relations with other countries. I mean, you could talk about so many ways that this has twisted out of shape what ought to be. Another prime example is the fact that we have a chemical industry person heading up the Environmental Protection Agency right now, which is not the way it's supposed to be.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, and this came in with an acceptance of the idea that we should evaluate everything that we do together, the investments the government makes in our health, our well-being, should be measured in a cost-benefit analysis, which was really just a device for it to focus on the profits that businesses make. Over here, they're very visible, they're very clear, they're immediate. And then over here is all the stuff we can't really quantify. But because we never really assessed the value of living ecosystem, now we're facing news like we've just heard this morning. So what the average person can do is say, I want my government back. I want money out of politics. I don't want lobbyists writing legislation. Right now we have 189 nations, I may have the number wrong, working on an international treaty. I think they're meeting in Geneva to add plastics to the Basel Convention. The Basel Convention is an international treaty that restricts the movement of wastes from country to country.
Oh, okay.
If they add plastics, that would be a big thing. That would really help. It would be the beginning of worldwide regulation of plastics in a more effective way. Oh, so who's over there trying to convince them not to do this? The lobbyists for the plastic industry. This is not the way government should work. Not our domestic government, not international governance. So we've got to get business interests out of governance so that governance is for the people. That's the essential idea of democracy, that's who it's for. And then the average citizen should take an interest in government. They should begin with an interest in good objective information and stop believing the propaganda that government is bad, business is good, and that left-wing newspapers, left-wing mainstream media is just another bias. Actually, left-wing mainstream media tries hard to get the truth. Maybe they don't succeed, but that's what they try to do. That's journalistic profession. The right-wing media doesn't try to do that. They're pressing an agenda, a political competitive agenda. We need to say enough of that. And citizens need to learn to trust each other. Left-wing citizens need to realize that they should not write off right-wing citizens and say, oh, whatever Trump does, they're going to always support him. There's no reason to believe that. We should have hope that we can change their minds by reaching out to them people to people. And right-wing citizens should stop being fearful and suspicious of left-wing intellectuals. That's this elite on the coast being their enemy is a false idea, like the false idea that government should get out of the way and let business do what they want. These are false ideas that citizens have an immediate and strong interest in opposing. Every citizen can do that. Then, once they freed themselves of this mental slavery, they should start getting involved in government. They should join committees at the local level. They should follow what agencies do. They should see if they can be on an advisory committee. They should take an interest in a particular issue. It won't take you long to become an expert at it and engage with other citizens. Don't just send money to the nonprofit organizations. Go down and talk with them. Go to their meetings. Engage with them. People need to be engaged. We have thought, hey, I'm going to go about my specialized life doing the thing that I do and living my life, and other people are going to do these other things. Well, they're not. They're not taking care of these other things. So it's time for the citizen to say, I too have a role to play in protecting the whole thing, not just my life. When that happens, when that cultural change happens, I think there will be some real hope, and I think there will be rapid progress.
We had Jay Kaufman, the former representative for this area, on the show a while back. And one of the things that he was dismayed about was the lack of civics education in the schools now.
Right.
And he mentioned that after the Parkland shootings, when those young people became so engaged, he discovered that one of the things about that situation was that there had been a big emphasis on civic education in the schools, which he believes gave the kids knowledge and tools to actually go out and do something when they were affected. So I imagine that plays into this. If people aren't studying civics in school, then they just don't know as much about how they might affect things as they would.
Well, one of the issues that I have about that awareness that we need that is people often then identify the problem, they demand that there be a civics class, and then they think that's going to solve it. And a civics class can be good or maybe not so good. we need to pay attention to this and figure out how to cultivate civics, and not just in classes, but in everything that we do.
Sure.
So, for example, how do things get built? They get built by going through a process of public notice and committee meetings. Well, why not make sure that the actual residents where something is going to be built are involved in that project, and doing affirmative outreach to get this. It's not just students that need to be involved in civics. We need to involve the entire population in civics.
Sure.
The other thing is that it can be built into all kinds of other classes. So let me describe something that happened in one of the classes that I teach.
Please do.
I teach at Boston University a class called Research for Environmental Agencies and Organizations, where the students do projects for environmental agencies and organizations. And I wrote a bill, which is in the legislature, to make it easier to sue the companies that put lead into the products where they knew it would have harmed people, and they did nothing to protect people.
Paint and gasoline?
Paint and gasoline and pipes and toys and other things. So this bill would not threaten any retailer, would not threaten landlords, parents. It would only be the people who put it in the product
Sure.
and took no action. And if they put it in the product and had a warning, the bill wouldn't hurt them at all. So it's the irresponsible incorporators of this toxin into our products where the reasonable person would have known it would harm people and took no responsibility.
No warning on the label.
Nothing. They could do take back, they could give a warning, they could have a protective covering, they could do all sorts of. This bill is in the legislature now, so for my class, I suggested to the Senator, Pat Jalen, who's put it in, that we could, actually she suggested that to me, that could have the class do legislative support.
Mm-hmm.
So my students did that. They wrote a bill summary. One of my students did a video explaining the law, which people find very effective. Mm-hmm. And they made presentations at the State House. So I invited all my other students to come, and some of my students came. And after the meeting, one of them said to me, "You wrote this bill? You're not a legislator."
Yeah.
And I said, "Yes, a citizen can write a bill, and if they can convince a legislator to put it in, it goes in." He said, "I had no idea that that could happen. I thought legislation was a closed process."
Wow. Well, this is the benefit of education.
And that's how civics can be brought into a not a civics class, although one could say that my class is applied civics.
Your students work on a lot of environmental projects.
Yes, so I just want to say one more thing about the lead litigation one, because the day after they did their presentation, which the students were thrilled to be presenting to important people,
Sure.
We went out to the Springfield Fair Housing Conference, which I just want to bring this up because it brings about the idea, it brings to the fore the idea that environmental issues are not peripheral. They're very intimately involved in our everyday lives.
Sure.
And so the students presented to fair housing advocates. And basically, we talked for a good bit of time about the fact that Massachusetts lead law focuses on the effect on children. If you have a kid under 6 and you are renting, the landlord has to make it lead safe. That's the concept of the law. This law is widely not followed, although it is followed someplace. There's a lot of problems with the law.
Okay.
But one of the big problems is discrimination. So landlords are making it very, very hard in certain parts of the state for families with kids to rent.
This is unintended consequences of
Right.
a well-intentioned program.
Right. But what most people might do with this is say, oh my God, we should be careful about legislating to protect children from lead. It's not the answer. So the conference organizer was one Meryl Bergquist, who's head of the Fair Housing Agency organization. And she has written a law review article saying all we need to do is take the kids part out, make it lead safe for everyone.
That's a brilliant idea.
It's a brilliant idea. And what that illustrates, not only is that, of course, lead is not by itself, it's with housing and has unintended effects. It's in a context. But that it gets messy once you start to see the whole context, but that if you keep working on it, you see ways out, which is actually an improvement. The lead law without the cutoff at the age of 6 is a better lead law.
It protects everybody.
It protects everybody, and we are all harmed by lead. Recent information is pointing up the impact on our cardiovascular system. So we've long known that lead causes hypertension in older people, but the extent to which it is causing deaths, there's one study out now by Bruce Lanphier, says that it's possibly the second leading cause of cardiovascular death.
Well,
So,
this is a bit of an aside, and we're going back in time a bit, but I've always been curious about this. We had leaded gasoline at one time.
yeah.
There must have been some awareness of the dangers of lead even then. And how did it come about that the petroleum industry got leaded gasoline onto the market?
This is a really good thing to focus on because it really is one of the original stories of how corporate interests learned to manipulate government process.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1924, I think it was 1920, Alice Hamilton, who was one of the great public health figures, and others, Randall Yardley, were forming this a national conference to deal with lead.
Mm-hmm.
And they were proposing.
Oh, in 1924?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were proposing bans on lead and gasoline at that time.
Oh, okay.
And the gasoline industry, which was just beginning to really make a lot of money off of their newly patented tetraethyl lead, which was an anti-knock compound, which
Sure.
made it easier to do a high power engine.
Sure.
Really worked hard to kind of get control over the Bureau of Mines, which was doing the study. And they managed within a few years to get the government to agree to submit their scientific studies for approval. So first they got in the process because they had some of the best scientists working on this.
The
although
industry.
They were captured scientists, the
Sure.
industry, yeah.
Sure.
But then they quietly worked until it actually worked that they had to get approval. The government had to get approval. So it's a long story involving propaganda and advertising. You remember the Dutch Boy campaign?
Sure.
Yes, that was a child playing with white paint, working with white paint. And the leaded white paint was sold as cleaner and as safer. So it's a good example of how industry united. Now, there were industrial sources at that time who wanted to move from lead. So when we talk about industry, and you've heard me already paint corporate interests as a source of great evil in this world, I want to make clear that I believe that there are good, responsible businesses out there, and I believe that they're rising and that they're growing, and that the environmental purchasing programs of this era, which were started mostly in government, helped create that market. So I see government acting to create a different kind of business, and it's working. And it's time for the consumer to really get behind patronizing the responsible companies and making the distinction between those companies who have practiced an unethical participation in democracy, getting their lobbyists in there to write legislation. They should not be doing that. And we should not be patronizing those companies, because there's more than enough responsible companies, good business people out there that we can patronize. So it's not a choice between giving up our lives of convenience and all the nice things that we have. It's just a choice between giving up where we get them from that are not serving our interests and choosing the ones that are willing to be responsible.
Well, in fact, it reminds me of a particular example. We were talking earlier about how several months ago a paper was published in Science magazine that said that the meat and dairy industries were a couple of the biggest contributors to global warming, and that if people became vegan or moved in the direction of veganism, that might be one of the most effective ways for people to reduce their carbon footprint. I've noticed that over the last year or so, new companies have sprung up who make vegan products. You see them more in the grocery stores, especially at places like Whole Foods. But there's been a response, and business people have said, there's a market here. We can make some money, we can make a product that people are going to want, potentially. Not everyone, but veganism is slowly growing as a way of eating. And a product called Beyond Burger just had an IPO. and is doing pretty well. Companies can latch on to good trends and produce a good product and do good in the world, I think.
And I think that that's a trend that we can all participate, like we can participate in government in fostering.
And you mentioned earlier that another personal choice might be flying, that it's a large contributor to global
Yeah, I think
warming.
it's far worse than what you eat.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what can be done about that? I mean, should we travel less? Should we should we drive instead? Should we push the industry to do something different?
All three.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and there are some things that can be done with airplane travel, jet travel, but they're going to be, minimal. I think we should try to convince all those billionaires who want to go to space for fun that that's not something that we want. Because we need to, and we also should protest the idea of using space for anything but Earth observation at this point. Earth is in an emergency, and every time you shoot a rocket up to space, it's far worse than the jet. And we need to use the space resources, the vantage point we have from space to monitor what's going on the Earth. This is enormously helpful, what we have so far, and we need to build that up. We shouldn't be adventuring beyond that for fun, for military, or for industrial profit. It's too costly.
Too costly and too environmentally costly.
And too much of a diversion. Look at Tesla. He had a wonderful electric vehicle, did tremendous work on batteries, and then he decides to go to space, and his company's not doing so well right now. I
Yeah.
want him to come back to Earth.
Speaking of space, I'm always a bit mystified by people's desire to go to Mars and perhaps even have a settlement there. And it seems like there are more pressing problems closer to home. And I sometimes suspect that some forward-thinking people think that, well, that would give us an out if we make
Yeah.
the Earth uninhabitable.
Oh, I think that's what they're thinking.
And all I can think of is Mars is already uninhabitable. Why would you want to go to an uninhabitable place
It'd be easier to
if
fix
we
this
can just
one.
fix this place?
Right.
Because we'll do the same thing there, right?
Right. No, it doesn't make much sense at all. Again, I don't want to offend anyone who loves the idea of space. I think we should still go to space, but for a different reason.
To better gather information about what
To
we're doing.
better help us fix the Earth, which is direly in need of our attention right now. And space gives us a great platform to do that. So I believe in going to space, but for that reason.
Observation.
So, but you asked me earlier about other projects in my class.
Yes.
So, yeah, I want to talk about one in particular. So, some years ago, I had a student who was great at geographical information systems,
Okay.
GIS. That's
Okay.
all the rage these days.
Yeah.
And I was in.
Can you just say a word about what that is?
Oh, it's
GIS?
it's mapping.
Okay.
It's basically it allows you to make maps really easily.
Okay.
So it's a great tool for environmental work. And I was in conversation with someone at Mass DEP, Tom Potter, about what we can do with brownfields contaminated sites. And he suggested that...
Is that a toxic?
Yes,
area?
those are places that have been contaminated.
Okay.
Yeah, we call them 21E in Massachusetts, or
Okay.
we call them Superfund nationally.
Okay.
So the cleanup program.
Okay.
And brownfields are ones that we are actually doing something about. Sometimes people say brownfields to mean them all, but usually it means we're bringing that one back into some use. And he said we need to look at the sites that are more vulnerable to climate change, more vulnerable to flooding now. And when we first did the risk analysis for this site and cleaned it up, we weren't thinking about those things necessarily. So now we need to look at that. So my student, Caitlin Tarrio, did some work looking at flood maps and contaminated sites and presented at DEP. This is a wonderful thing for a student to do, to present to the advisory committee.
And this is the state environmental
The state
organization.
Department of Environmental Protection. And they have an advisory committee on cleanup of contaminated sites.
Okay.
So it's a public thing. As I said, citizens can go to these meetings of all these kinds of committees and be engaged in an issue that they decide they care about. So these were mostly professionals, but anyone can come. So she presented at that. They had never seen anything like that before. She was extremely well received. Great experience for her. She's now got work doing GIS systems.
Yeah.
And so in my current class, my last class that I just had, I had another student who said, I love GIS. I want to see what I can do with it.
Mhm.
So I said, well, let's work with Caitlin and take this a little bit further. Caitlin's still around. He got from her a quick training in how to do what she'd done. And then I had a number of other students who got involved. We looked at just one watershed area, the Mystic River watershed. And we mapped all the contaminated sites, and we mapped chemical storage sites. Now, there's a body of information called the Tier 2. It's from something called EPCRA, Emergency Planning Community Rights No Act, which was established after the Bhopal gas disaster in India. If you
I remember that. I
Yeah.
remember that. A lot of people died. Union Carbide.
Very good,
Yeah.
which went out of business because they didn't take responsibility, I think.
That was a heinous, I was going to say crime, maybe it was, but a heinous accident.
I would say that it was negligence
Okay.
in the highest degree. I wouldn't
Okay.
say it was a crime. They tried to say it was sabotage by a worker, but there's no sense in that. They never had any evidence for that.
Okay.
But they left a water reactive chemical in place.
And for people who haven't
just-
heard of that, there was a release of a toxic gas that killed many people.
Methyl isocyanate, very toxic. It was just sitting there, ready to react with water, because they had moved production to some other part of the world. So, and they left it there. At any rate, EPCRA now produces all this information for local officials that respond to emergencies, like fire departments. They're called local emergency planning committees, to know where chemicals are stored in the neighborhood. So it's all actually public, but most of the public never looks at this, and it is easy to get access to it. But access has been compiled in the form of a GIS map by an office of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Office of Technical Assistance, OTA, has put this on the web. You can get all the chemical storage information that you want. So we downloaded it. Well, not all that you want, but you get a lot.
Okay.
We downloaded the chemical storage information for the Mystic River. We downloaded the contaminated sites. We put that together in a map and looked at the flooding risk. And we told the Mystic River Watershed Association and several other interested parties what was most vulnerable to flooding in the case of a bad storm. And it turns out there's a lot of facilities of concern in there, as there are in many others. And then this student did this amazing thing of saying, I had asked him, do you think you could trace where the release will go if it's released? And he came up with a computer program that looks at the flow direction.
Yeah.
So we
That's
presented
invaluable
this. It's an
information.
incredible thing for the
Yeah.
students to do. I don't know that it's been done before. So I now have to write this up, put it on the web, see who I can get it out to. But I think it's a stunning contribution that the students made. I mean, our methodology is not perfect. We made assumptions about chemical risk, but we showed that you could put it together. Other people could do a more sophisticated job of it. But this is the kind of thing that people can be doing today to respond to the dangers that we're now in. We don't have to just sit here and take it. And these students are worried about the world. And giving them this to do was, I think, not just educational for them, but I think it's therapeutic. They feel like they're getting something done, like they're making a difference.
Because I think one of the worst aspects of our present situation is that you can slip into feeling hopeless.
Yeah.
You might walk around with this free-floating anxiety in your life from day to day. What's going to happen with climate change? What's going to happen with these other things? It never really goes away if you think about it.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that the great value that I've had in being an environmentalist my whole life is that it's therapeutic for that. And I think that it's not that I've been made happy by looking at all of these problems, but I am not plagued by nightmares, at least not during the night. During the day when I'm reading materials, I'm living the nightmare.
Waking nightmares.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But I'm feeling much better because I'm doing something about it. And that's what I try to give to my students, and which they almost all of them seem to just lap up eagerly. At the end of this research class, I asked my students to write up a little bit about their experience. And almost 80%, something like 80% of them say, this was amazing because I felt like I've done something. I've accomplished something.
It's a crucial role of education, I think. Make people feel like they understand something well enough to take action. Any other student projects? you'd
Oh,
like to
yeah,
mention?
there was so for several years, students have elected, I'd give them a bunch of choices of projects and then they choose. Students always have elected to work on environmental justice.
Sure.
So a few years ago, we wrote an environmental justice municipal ordinance, and that went through a few different iterations. We were focusing on how do you attract clean industries, not just keep out dirty industries? How do you engage the public? How do you make sure that this is an ongoing effort that actually works? And we got into things like, well, let me put it this way. It ended up being a vision transforming environmental justice neighborhoods into green communities, where we laid out all these different policies that put together might actually achieve this. So you don't just want to keep out the dirty industries and stop pollution. You want to bring in the clean industries. You want to do local workforce development that's targeted to what you're bringing in. The problem with a lot of workforce development, such as that, which happened after the Obama response to the financial crisis, it was ARA, was that was just generalized money and it wasn't targeted enough.
Okay.
So a lot of people
This is
look.
money for retraining people?
It was money for actually a lot of environmental jobs,
Okay.
green jobs.
Okay, green
but
jobs.
It was, like so many things, it didn't work as well as it should have, and then people say, oh, well, that doesn't work. Well, that's not the lesson we should draw from
Sure.
it. It worked some, and to make it work really better, we need to do more and more targeted and more developed and more sophisticated.
Right.
So we were talking about doing that. And local small business assistance and local development that people are engaged in. So, for example, they're going to build a big factory over here, and then people don't even know about it until they start driving the trucks in and out. And then they go, hey, what's going on? Look at all this traffic, look at all this dirt, all this dust. Well, but they could have known a year ago when public notice was first placed, but,
Sure.
but nobody noticed. So
Sure.
doing a better job of that. We looked at those things. And then we were working with, one of our clients was the Boston Public Health Commission. And so we're sitting down with them talking about this vision of green communities. And they said, well, but you'll just cause gentrification.
Because you're improving an area and then people will want to move in?
People
Rents
will want to
go
move
up?
in, rents will go up, and the people that you're trying to benefit won't be able to live there anymore. So for this past semester, we focused on what we call eco-gentrification.
Okay.
So we've realized that it's not going to be enough, even though that was a big set of things to do to make EJ neighborhoods greener communities, that's not enough. So this semester we focused on affordable housing, rent stabilization. One complaint I want to make now is that everyone says rent control, but I'm from New York City, where rent control meant that the rent could never change. Much more common and reasonable was rent stabilization. Rent stabilization meant that it could only go up a certain amount each turnover, which was constantly violated because nobody knew what the amount was and they violated it. But
There's some talk about bringing that back in Cambridge, but that's
they
an
keep
aside.
talking about rent control.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
they need to be talking about rent stabilization because
Okay.
that's much more amenable to the economic concerns
Sure.
about housing, and much easier to get the gradation so that it works for everybody.
Sure.
Tenant assistance, cleanup of brownfields, all sorts of things that we need to do to keep people in the neighborhood while we improve their neighborhood. So it's a new focus, and we've been using the term neighborhood-led redevelopment.
What are some of the areas locally, actual physical places where this has been a focus? Are there particular neighborhoods, say in Boston or Cambridge or elsewhere, where there's been attempts to clean things up and concerns about gentrification as well?
Yeah, there have. There's the Dudley Square Initiative, and there's places in Boston where this kind of development has happened, and there's much more neighborhood involvement. Community development organizations specialize in this.
Okay.
But I think it needs to be greatly expanded. And our way of thinking, our way of thinking now is, well, the big game in town now is the opportunity zones, which is created under this administration, which gives developers huge tax breaks for coming into a blighted area. However, they can come into the blighted area and build a Trump hotel. I mean, they're going to get a tax break for that. That's not the kind of development we want. That's a very crude way of thinking about this.
Is that on the federal level?
That's
the
on the federal
opportunity
level.
zones?
Yeah. So we actually had a very interesting thing happen here in Massachusetts, which is that so the state is supposed to define its opportunity zones, and they've defined them in places like Franklin Park and the Boston Islands, and it kind of looks like they don't really want the opportunity zones to function. But then some of them are in gateway cities, which is a previous example of an attempt to revitalize neighborhoods. But I guess my point is that environment is not out there. It's in here. It's in our cities. It's everything that we do. It's our built environment as well as the natural environment.
You made me think of Boston Harbor and how filthy it used to be and how it's been improved. It seems like a remarkable project in itself. How did that come about?
Well, I think the big point about that needs to be said in today's, referring to today's emergency, is that that's another example that government works.
Right.
So there's so many examples that government works, and we're laboring under this idea, this false propaganda that we should just get government out of the way. Government is the only entity that's going to take care of something like that. What business makes money from cleaning up Boston Harbor?
Right. Except for a private contractor, maybe, who's hired to
who's paid by
do some kind of a task, who is paid by government.
Who's paid by government.
That's right.
Right.
That's
yeah.
and directed by government.
Right.
That's right.
And that illustrates that private competition can be great if it's in the context of cooperation.
Sure.
So government says this is what the people need. They need a clean harbor. They need trees. They need ecosystems. Government is the all-embracing context. And then government can issue contracts for people to get the job done. And when they compete with each other, government can select the best.
Sure.
So competition is great, but it has to be subsumed within this context that's good for all of us.
Sure.
And the problem is that context has been taken away, and competition is now the context. So Trump is doing this with foreign policy. It's America against everybody else.
Sure.
And this is happening all around the world. It's my group against everybody else. I'm going to withdraw into my group. So if you wanted to say, what is the essential problem? To me, it's that. We're not doing contextual management. We need to reassert the context that we're all here together. This is all one sphere, living biosphere. We're all members of that.
Isn't that socialism, though?
It is.
I'm being ironic, but
No.
this is exactly what certain people will say.
It is, but let's look at why socialism is a scary word.
Sure.
So do you remember Meher Baba?
No.
Back in the 60s, you're younger than me.
A little bit.
It was a big deal. And his little cards were all over the place. I had a picture of his smiling face, and he said, "Don't worry, be happy." That's where it came
Sure.
from.
That's where it
Bobby
came from?
McFerrin didn't invent "Don't worry,
Okay.
be happy." It was
Okay.
Meher Baba who spread that around.
Okay.
And on the back of the card, it said, "Dissolve like a drop into the big ocean, into the great ocean," or something like that.
Right.
And I remember reading that and going, "No, I don't want to dissolve into like a drop."
Well, if you dissolve entirely, then you're gone. But
But I think that's what people are afraid of. People
Sure.
are afraid that they feel secure within their own definition of themselves, within the group that they've chosen.
Right.
That may have no relation to what's important in reality. And they're a little afraid of having that dissolved in the great ocean. And that's one of the things that socialism does. It says we're all like democracy. It says we're all the same and we're all part of one big social unit. That's one fear. I think that if we prize the individual, each life form, not just people, we don't have to worry about that. So there's a kind of duality. There's everything, and then there's you yourself. If you can do both and not just choose one or the other, I think we can be okay with not dissolving in the great ocean. We go into the great ocean and we still are ourselves.
Sure.
The other fear with socialism is that it will become a dictatorship.
that it will morph into communism.
Right.
The negative communism that we saw in the Soviet Union and
Right.
places like that.
So as long as we remain happy with our American idea of private property and entrepreneurship, which, again, I'm not the least bit against business. I'm against unethical business.
Sure.
And I'm for ethical business. So I don't consider myself a socialist in the way that the conservatives are trying to make us afraid of socialism.
There is a fear-mongering effort in that regard now.
Big time.
And I think socialism is often used in a way that where it will conjure up images of something much more harsh than what actually exists in the world.
Well, we have socialism in European countries. We have socialism to extent in this country.
Socialist programs, certainly.
To me, socialism is just, recognizing the fact that we're one great big social organism, and that we should think that way. Doesn't mean everybody has to be the same, or that they take away your private property. That's dictatorship.
Sure.
We're Americans and we believe in freedom.
Yeah.
I think most everybody wants freedom, probably in a different way than we do. But I think that it's possible to, as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We can say we are one great social organization. All humans are part of humanity. All Americans are part of America. We can say that at the same time as I want mine. I have mine. Don't take it away from me.
Right. How do you think that the American emphasis on competition enters into the environmental challenges that we're faced with?
Well, people are enamored of the cost analysis. So I mentioned cost-benefit analysis, which inherently discounts future benefits. So you can't actually do cost-benefit analysis unless you put a discount factor in. And the discount factor by itself says money in the future is not worth as much as money now. So first, it reduces everything to money. I already mentioned that misses a lot of value. It actually supplants value choices that the legislation and the people might make by saying, no, the money analysis is more important than what you care about, so those two things are wrong. But then the third thing is it goes against the constitutional principle that we should protect this world for posterity. That's in the preamble to the Constitution. Preserve the blessings of liberty for posterity.
Sure.
And it's something that people have seen as a responsibility in all cultures and all ages, except bad ones. And we're now veering into the category of bad because we are not protecting our resources for future generations. We're not protecting our children's health. And that is because of the the priority of competitive aims.
And what does that say about how well we care for our children and grandchildren, and how what we're willing to do to make sure that they have a chance at a healthy, happy life?
Well, I think about those parents who spent $600,000 to get their kids into an Ivy League school.
Right.
And that they are doing that, I have to imagine, because they love their children and they want to do well by them. But they're so ingrained in a competitive frame that they don't see that they're not helping their children. Any child who in that position now seems illegitimate, and the kid may have had their own accomplishments now being taken away from them.
Right.
So their parents have done them a great disservice. Their parents have taught them that you should do whatever you can to get ahead, and it's almost as if you have no responsibility for other people.
Right.
So I think it's very, very sad, and it's not that we don't love our children, it's that we don't know how to love our children.
It's a fair point, because people certainly do love their children.
I think they do.
The question becomes, it's in the particulars. What do you do to manifest it?
And I think that if we could really look intently at the influence that commercialization has had on our lives, and how we have reoriented ourselves to be branding ourselves, to be taking advantage of opportunities, all with the aim of generating revenue rather than real value. And if we started to think about what is really of value to us, there's so much written about people who succeed and then aren't happy. We need to think directly about what makes us happy. And that is life. That is people, trees, enjoyment, engagement. And it's not piling up money so that you can feel secure. If we could get security some other way, such as through socialism,
Right.
which says, don't worry, we'll take care of you. We got a safety net. Just go out there. You can take risks. That's how you love your children. You support them. That's how society can support its members. Just provide that foundation. And the other thing I think government can do is bring us together. I think government, we can expect this of government, convene us, call for us to come together around all sorts of issues that are of common concern. And so I say citizens should go out there and get engaged, but I think we should also call on government to bring us together. That might mean providing stipends for people who are low income to actually take time off of work. It may mean talking to their jawboning their employers to let them take some time off of work.
And there's talks about something called universal basic income. I don't know a lot about it, but I guess the idea is everybody gets at least something, even if they can't work for some reason.
Yeah, I think the idea is we don't just let people die and suffer if we can help it. And I think that that's a great value. Much, so people say, well, we can't afford that. Well, we can't not afford that. And what is it that we think we can afford? Building more high-rise buildings, building faster jets, building more cell phones, and then are we collecting and recycling all the old cell phones that went out of service?
Not all of them by any means.
No.
You can drop them in a container when you go into Best Buy, but...
and I laud Best Buy for what they do.
I'm sure that they do the right thing with that stuff, but...
I don't know.
But how do the rest of us know for sure what happens?
Well, there are ways to find out. And so if you decided to follow my advice and become an expert on one of the topics,
Right.
and you did electrical waste, electronics waste,
Yeah.
you would find out that there are ways to track what happens.
Okay.
There's an international standard, I think it's called R2. I haven't studied this for a while.
Okay.
I used to be very involved in this at the beginning of this movement. I was actually the guy who had the idea for the Electronic Product Recovery and Recycling Conference, which was the first national conference and on this issue.
Well,
But then I've had many other things come my way, and I
Sure.
have not been involved. However, I'm mindful of one of the papers that a student just wrote in one of my other classes. One of my other classes is called Developing Sustainable Environmental Responsibility. And it's a unique class. Like the research class, these are two classes I invented that were not there. And I thank Boston University for letting me run them. In this class, we look at how do you wrap your head around the entire problem? How do you be a generalist and not just a specialist in your particular thing? How do we create the relationships? How do we work as a team? And how do we think about system change? So changing production, water, the natural cycles that we're disrupting, the economic system. How do we work on all of that? And at the end of the class, the students pick a problem, which is one of the things I try to teach them. I say it's all too much, so
Sure.
pick a few things that you can focus on, but don't dissociate yourself from everything else. Try to keep a handle on everything and form a big picture while specializing. And so she looked at batteries and single-use batteries. And I remember when the battery recycling stuff started, it was all around the recyclable batteries. But at the beginning, some places, say household hazardous waste collections, were taking single-use batteries, and now they don't anymore.
well, is it true that at one time they tended to have toxic materials like mercury and cadmium, and those have been removed?
Well, they still have materials that are not totally great to put in the waste incinerator.
Okay.
And which can be recovered for further use. So
Sure.
even if we're just talking about zinc, that's a useful material that we go out there and mine, and would probably be easier to mine from a pile of batteries. But there also are acids in there, and there are other things. And
Okay.
I can't tell you that all mercury has been removed from all the single-use batteries. And I remember when the camera shop was in Lexington, they had a little box for the button batteries,
Sure.
which were definitely lots of mercury.
Yep.
And I don't see those around anymore. So
Yeah.
I really don't know. This is something I need to revisit. But what the student impressed on me was we can recycle single-use batteries. So this says to me, okay, this is just a question of will. Technically, it's feasible. And if it's economically not feasible, then government support can be used to make it economically feasible. This is something we could do.
And there must be just tons of single-use batteries
There's tons
thrown
of them.
away.
And all our waste now is going to the incinerators. The landfills are being closed. We're losing that capacity. And the incinerator is not a good place for our waste to go. What we need to do is start pulling out all the different categories of waste and finding reuses for them, creating circular economies. And we're going to be able to find them. So the example of the batteries is an example of how it can be done. And once we do it, we're going to save money. That's if you look at the big picture. Now, the company that's dedicated to mining zinc isn't going to save money. They're going to lose money once we learn how to get it from the waste.
That's right.
So they're going to say this is money losing, this is hurting profits, this is bad for the economy. That's when you look at the economy that way. But if you
My
look,
little piece.
or by gross national product,
Oh, I see.
yeah,
Yep,
which is just looking at exchanges.
I see.
So we have this big problem between looking at the exchange value of things, what you can sell it for, its essence as a commodity, and the existence value of things, which is what we would apply to ourselves,
Yeah,
but also to a resource that doesn't need to be wasted.
sure.
This is where government can invest in creating the incentives for taking things back and reusing them. And what that will do is transform the economy. And it will hurt people who are dependent on profits from extractive industries. And we have to recognize that they have now gotten, or maybe not they particular, but people like them who have been hurt by the prospect of disruption in their investments, in the value of their investments, have learned to engage with government and manipulate it and to do propaganda to get public support for their actions. We need to kind of trace that back and see that pattern everywhere.
Can a company that mines zinc create a new division that recovers zinc from disposable batteries?
So here's the thing. You've got, as I said, the unethical companies and the ethical companies. And then
Sure.
there's the ones in the middle, which are probably far more numerous
Yeah.
than either other side. And those are the ones that, when they see the handwriting on the wall, make the right choice.
Sure.
So what we need to do is government probably only needs to invest enough to make them see the handwriting on the wall. And then they go, oh, we see a future where extraction is seen as too damaging, and it'll be limited. You'll do some extraction, but only as necessary, and that the priority is to mine what we need from the waste stream. And once they see that, then competition works its wonders, and entrepreneurship, which I love. I'm a capitalist.
Sure.
I'm a socialist capitalist.
Sure.
Will come into play, and government's action will make sure that it focuses on the right places and will help guide it to where it needs to be. So it's not that I'm against business. I'm for business, but I want business to be guided by government, and I want government to be guided by people who are engaged because they care.
Well, we've got a few minutes left. Can I mention just one or two particular topics that,
You're the boss.
that we haven't touched on? But I'm personally curious about. I've thought about them recently. One of them is apparently some folks are starting to push a return to nuclear energy as a way of slowing down climate change.
Right.
What are your thoughts about that prospect?
I'm very disturbed by when people claim that nuclear energy is carbon-free, because if I think about this cycle, the entire cycle of the industry, I begin with the uranium mines, which take a lot of energy and make a lot of waste, radioactive tailings and runoff from that. And then the material goes to a whole series of plants that basically is a government subsidy for the industry, where the material is refined and milled and refined, and the ore is worked until it becomes something that can be used in a power plant. And this also produces materials for weapons. So I have
that very process.
Yeah, that whole process, which is actually done with very little scrutiny in large plants around the country. So, for example, there was the feed materials plant in Fernald, Ohio, which residents thought was, making food for cattle.
Oh.
But it was the feed materials for the nuclear cycle, and they were actually polluting the area with radioactive materials. So there are a lot of places like this.
I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah, or there's the Pantex bomb assembly plant, where people don't really necessarily know what's going on. And we have these large facilities all across the country, and they have been large sources of pollution and energy use. Then when you build the nuclear power plant, you pour a lot of concrete, which is not carbon neutral. Then when you transport the waste, which hopefully you do at some point, or hopefully you don't do at some point, you are, again, not carbon neutral. When you are managing that waste for thousands and thousands of years, you're not going to be carbon neutral. So it's not carbon neutral. That's a problem. However, if you've already built the plant and we're now suffering from an emergency, I'm not for immediately shutting down all operating nuclear plants unless they're unsafe, which they may be, and we need to scrutinize that very carefully, because the consequences of an accident, I mean, my God, Chernobyl, Fukushima are just the best known.
Yeah.
A lot of people aren't aware that there have been many more accidents. So when people say no one's ever been killed by nuclear power, that's an outright falsehood, which has been said a lot. And when they say it's carbon neutral, that's a falsehood. We now have a nuclear waste, the spent rods, at sites all across the country, because we have not created a repository, because the repository is maybe not a good thing to create and unfair to whoever has to receive it, the people of Nevada.
There was a talk about a particular mountain
Yucca Mountain
being
in Nevada.
Yucca Mountain.
Right.
We were going to put it inside there.
Right, that's
Yeah,
right.
And that hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened for many reasons. And then the transporting of the rods to that place is protested by many people. So now, thankfully, we're pulling some of it out of those swimming pools, which are, as we've seen from Fukushima, are just waiting to be released in an accident. And many of these places are low-lying flood, because they were built near rivers or water sources so they could cool.
And where heat is discharged into the water,
That's
which,
right.
which is not environmentally neutral either.
And in fact, a couple of years ago, they had to shut down some nuclear power plants because they were discharging too much hot water into already too hot rivers because of the heat waves that we were having. It's not particularly viable. A history of nuclear plants is economics. They've been vastly supported by government subsidies. They're not encouraging economic story. There are alternatives that are far more attractive and feasible and quickly implementable. So I'm not enamored with nuclear power.
And those alternatives, are those things like solar, wind, hydro, or other things altogether?
Yes, all those things all together. And what we really need to do is transform the system from a one-way system that's like owned by large investors, and they've got a power plant that sends power out, and we all just sit there and take it, thank you very much,
Sure.
to one in which it's called distributed generation. We have solar panels all over the place. And yes, there are people who are getting upset about solar panels all over the place. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue putting them where they belong. And we should be more mindful of where they don't belong. So there's a movement against wind turbines on beautiful hillsides, and I totally understand that. And there are other places that we can put them. But just because there's a couple of places which offend some people doesn't mean we should turn against the whole idea. People are talking about air source heat pumps being able to replace a good deal of our heating and cooling in our buildings and make our buildings more efficient. And again, we've got problems that we're going to run into. Those things have gases in them that need to be collected afterwards. I don't hear anybody talking about that yet, but we can deal with that if we do. There are answers, and then there's the work we need to do to make those answers really work really well. And I think that anyone who looks into that, or looks into how we could have a richer system of generation, how we could have microgrids, so you have greater control over the grid at the local level. You can feed in and feed out local power, and you're not losing huge amounts of your electricity by transmitting it long distances. The old model where we thought, oh, just put out the bid and the investors will build it for us, has produced a certain kind of electrical system. We need a new system where we're all engaged that will open up jobs for many small businesses, opening up the prospect of a cleaner system overall.
Distributed energy.
Distributed energy, microgrids.
Microgrids.
It'll be more resilient.
Okay.
When there's a blackout, you won't go out. Everybody used to say wind and sun, they're no good, they're intermittent.
Sure.
Well, with good batteries, that's not a problem.
Yeah, we do have these things called batteries.
Yeah.
And they're getting better. They're getting better.
And we need to recycle them all.
Right.
We need to make sure they're all, we need that recycling infrastructure. Now, one of the great things that I learned recently was that those batteries for solar systems can be reconditioned. So they go down, the system goes down, but actually 90-something% of what's in there is still good. You just need to redo them, rearrange them.
Well, we're out of time, but I'm glad we're ending on a hopeful, constructive note.
I hope that is.
Let's look into distributed systems. I'm going to go home and look that up myself. But thank you for coming on. This has been fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
We've covered a lot of area here, and I've learned a lot. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve.
You bet. You've been watching In Conversation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.